Good evening, everyone, and welcome to another episode of This is Revolution Podcast. I am your host, Jason Miles. If you are new to the show, please hit the like. Please hit subscribe. Please don't forget to hit that bell, as we are constantly adding new programs to the channel all the time. For about the last 6 months or so, we've been doing This is Revolution Presents, or TIR Presents, on Wednesdays. Where we have a different show on Wednesdays, and the second Wednesday of every month has been a video essay. And last night we premiered the video essay called Welcome to the Terror Dome. And there will be an article that I wrote, similar to the script of that essay, a little more in depth, coming out on Sublation Media. And if it's not out this Sunday, I believe it'll be out Monday. So take a look for that. I'll definitely be posting it all over social media. I'm very excited about that. Also, Pascal will not be with us tonight, as he was with us Tuesday, and he definitely came on with me for the recap of the video essay. So if you haven't seen it, definitely when this is over, there's a whole playlist of all the video essays and the recap shows. But that was a real fun show. We even talked about it even more in depth early this morning when he called me. And yeah, don't worry, he is fine. I see people saying, is he okay? Yes, he is fine. It's just we're coming back slowly. You know, he fell ill, so don't want to throw him back in the fire. And bigger than that, there's a lot of writing that he wants to do. The moment he came back, he wanted to get back in the writing dojo, as we call it. So I'm kind of excited. And one of the projects, I don't know if I should say it yet. I won't say it yet, but I'll wait to ask him. And if I can, I'm very excited to announce what one of the things he's writing is, because I can't wait to read it. Also, I can see some of the comments, and someone named Slaytanic said they love the intro music. Anyone that has Slayer in their screen name that digs the intro music, that means I'm doing something right. And surely I'm not trying to overwork Pascal. That's why Pascal gets all these rest days. So Pascal is like Shaq now. If you remember the Shaq era of his time in LA, where he had all this rest time, we're resting Shaq for the playoffs. Tuesday night is playoffs. So I have a special guest host. As usual, I try to find guest hosts that can help me with the big guest. And you guys know this guest. He's a legal scholar. He's a law professor. I can't walk into law professor guest without a guest host that's law professor adjacent. So our special guest has been working in immigration law. Is it 20 years? 15 years. 15 years sound about right? This young lady's also an Albany High alum. Please welcome special guest host Jessica San Luis.
Thanks for having me.
Thank you for helping. Some people don't know this, but I will say this: behind the scenes, sometimes Jessica actually helps me with some of the intro monologues, especially when they're very legally. And we did a show 3 months or so ago talking about Roe v. Wade, and Jessica actually helped me with getting into some of the weeds of the legalese behind Roe v. Wade. So legal. Give it up for Jessica. And let's bring in the man you guys are all waiting to see. He brings the fire every time he's on the show. He recently has a piece that is in Sublation Media right now. If you look at the description of the show, there should be a link in the description to the piece. He also has a book coming out on Sublation Media. Please welcome Professor Norm Finkelstein. What's going on, Professor?
I'm here.
You are.
I'm waiting to get to the content.
Oh my God. Okay. Jessica, you want to ask the first question?
Sure. We're
Maybe,
talking.
Jessica, maybe you can begin with just a broad background, since you know Roe. What is the topic of this evening's discussion, and why are we discussing it?
The topic of this evening's discussion is the original Roe v. Wade decision and kind of whether or not it's rooted in constitutional law and how it's important now because of the recent leak of the decision that may or may not be coming out soon that Justice Alito wrote.
And before we even get into the first question, do both of you think that there's a kind of a misunderstanding in the lay public of what the Roe decision is?
Absolutely.
Well, before we even get back to that question, before we even go to it, let me just give you some background in terms of my own life, because I lived at the time when Roe was enacted as law. One of the interesting things, and I have to be careful because there is another guest and I want to respect her opinion, so you'll stop me when I'm going on too long. I mean that. I was recently looking at the cases that preceded Roe, and it will come as a shock, I think, to most of the people in your audience how recent so many of our rights, which we take for granted, are. So, in line with the Roe decision, 1965 was the first time the Supreme Court ruled that married couples had the right to use contraception. Up until 1965, a married couple did not have the legal right to use contraception.
That's correct.
Now, just bear in mind, I know I give away my age. I was already 12 years old when that when that opinion was handed down by the court. Then 1967 was Loving versus Virginia. In the United States, there were about 12 to 15 states in which it was illegal for a black person to marry a white person. That was the law of the land. That what were called anti-miscegenation laws, anti-race mixing laws. It was the law of the land. By 1967, I was already 14 years old, and it was illegal in large parts of the United States for a black person to marry a white person.
But you're from New York though. But was it a little more common to see those kind of relationships in New York though?
I wouldn't call them common, but they were legal.
Okay.
We wouldn't call it common, but there was no question of the law. Just the other day, I reread the Loving opinion, and it would just shock you if you read what the judge said in the lower court. The judge in Virginia defending the anti-miscegenation laws, he just said God created 7 different races, black, white. He threw in this race called Malay, M-A-L-A-Y. I'm not even sure who he was referring to. And that if it weren't for these anti-miscegenation laws, all these races would be mixing, and that was against the word of God. That's how it was reasoned, the anti-miscegenation laws, as late as 1967. Then 1969 was the first court case which legalized your right, Jason, to look at pornography in the privacy of your home. Up until that, Jason, you could have ended up in successive jail terms.
I don't know who you think I am, but look, there's a Bible. I should go get it. It's just right on my nightstand because that's what I do. The Lord is my hands.
So
it's important to this conversation though to talk about how those cases were more or less rooted in the 14th Amendment protections.
Yeah, we'll get to that. I'm just trying to give you my generation's view on it. You'll be surprised, Jason, to learn. I think you'll be surprised to learn that in 1986, in the case called Bowers versus Hardwick, our Supreme Court, now remember, by 1986, I am already 35 years old. In 1986, the Supreme Court ruled there's no constitutional law protecting same-sex sodomy. It was illegal. The Supreme Court ruled illegal as late as 1986, ruled same-sex sodomy not protected by the Constitution. That was only overturned, believe it or not, a constitutional protection for the right to same-sex sodomy didn't occur until 2003. Now, when were you born, Jason?
Say it again.
What year were you born?
1977.
So already 25 years after you were born was same-sex sodomy first legalized in the United States. And in my generation, the two litmus test cases were Roe and Bakke. Bakke, the affirmative action case, Roe, the abortion case. If you were a liberal, you supported Roe, or you support abortion, you support affirmative action. If you were a conservative, you opposed abortion and you opposed affirmative action. Those were the litmus test cases. So my generation, if you're a person on the left end of the spectrum, there is very little tolerance for disagreement on Roe, the right to abortion, because for our generation, it was the litmus test case. And I've found that there has been a lot of hostility to what I've had to say in the topic, in my opinion, not because of my reasoning, but because I dare to question the Roe decision, because it was so sacrosanct for my generation. It was your Obama of my generation.
Well, it's interesting that you say that, because last year when we did that show, I found some old newspaper articles from Bernie Sanders and Joe Biden. They were both getting into office around the same time. And this was a big deal for they weren't even in the Senate. I think they were congressmen at the time. Bernie might even have been, was he the mayor first before he was a congressman? And so
I think it was mayor first and then congressman.
And that was part of, both of their campaigns, and they were at very opposite ends of the spectrum on the Roe decision. So it is interesting that you're bringing this up. Also, I did read an article. It was in, maybe it was Yahoo News. I don't think it was the Times, the LA Times, but it was Fauci. Dr. Fauci had been studying bathhouses in the 80s, and I found that funny and informative at the same time. Because how does one study a bathhouse?
I guess just by going.
He played a critical role during the AIDS epidemic, Fauci. That's when his reputation began. He was criticized at the beginning, but as time unfolded, his reputation improved, which is one reason I felt one has to respect, at least in part, his judgment, because he seemed to have earned it during his tenure. I forgot what position he held during the AIDS epidemic.
I believe it was the same one he's got now. He's been in the position for the 6 presidencies.
Something like that.
Yeah, that's an interesting position to hold for that long time. But yeah, I don't want to say shocked, but I do appreciate the fact that Bernie Sanders has been Bernie Sanders since 1973. Right.
Well, very few people, I think, changed their opinion on Roe for my generation. It became almost in your DNA. And I noticed when I was sending around drafts of my current book, I noticed that when I sent it to people from my generation, they got very angry. at what I had to say about Roe and what I had to say about Baki. It really rubbed them the wrong way. Whereas for the younger age cohort who read drafts, those in their 20s, it didn't in the least faze them what I had to say. Maybe because they didn't live in pre-Roe, so they don't know how terrible that period was. But I noticed that their reaction was much more subdued. They were much more concerned about what I had to say about the transgender phenomenon or pronouns or things like that than what I had to say about Roe and Baki.
Well, those are like, culture war.
I think they're intergenerational culture wars.
The thing about Roe that was fascinating to me in doing the research for that show, and we did a few other shows actually last year on abortion, surprisingly, and I want to keep saying this. We did these shows not as a reaction to whatever the mainstream media was. We did these shows, we thought they were important shows that we needed to cover. And one thing that was fascinating to me was that there are so many laws in states right now that criminalize when pregnant women get in accidents. There was a case that actually caught some attention where a woman was shot while she was pregnant, and she got first charged with attempted murder. There was, I believe it was in Alabama, there was a significant backlash, and then the charges were later dropped. But there's a lot more cases you don't hear about in places like Michigan of car accidents and people getting charged, falling downstairs. It's rather frightening what's on the books now in different states.
At the state level, criminal charges can be brought, and a determination is made about an unborn child that, arguably shouldn't be made even at the state level.
Well, I do think there is some things that we need to explain, because I think a lot of politics on these shows get lost in federal and state. And I think people's understanding of states' rights might end with Civil War debates. But seriously, so talk real quick, Jessica, if you could, about the difference between the state and the Fed level when it comes to abortion rights.
Well, I mean, I can make it more general than that. There's language in the Constitution that basically gives states the right to codify their own laws to a certain extent, where the federal law doesn't cover. States have that right, and that's actually a really important right. And I think people lose track of that when they're arguing the politics of Roe, because Roe is the federal government coming in and making a decision for something that arguably should be a decision of the state legislature. I think Mr. Finkelstein's better at talking about the differences between those, but I mean that is an issue, and it's something that we need to talk about, because there are many states in which abortion is already legal, and those were laws that were codified at the state level, and that's an important distinction.
I wonder if you can clarify that, because I myself am not fully knowledgeable in this area. You said there are states in which abortion is already illegal.
Legal.
Or already legal.
Correct.
Yes, and that was the case before Roe.
That's right.
Right. And the main issue with Roe was it discovers for a certain period in a woman's pregnancy, for a defined period in a woman's pregnancy, it discovers there is a constitutional right to privacy, which states cannot infringe on, therefore they can't legislate, and that protected the Roe decision, having discovered that right to privacy, protected the woman's right to abortion for a defined period. The period defined by Roe was up to what's called viability, which basically means the ability of a fetus to survive outside the womb with hooked up to machines, of course, medical machines. Up until that point, a woman has the right to an abortion. And that's a constitutionally protected right, which therefore limits the right of states to pass laws regarding abortion.
I mean, I think there's also something that I think we should talk about is that there's a slippery slope in determining the age when a fetus can survive outside of the womb, because that's changing all the time. The age at which a fetus could survive outside of the womb in 1973 is very different than it is now because of medical advancements.
Actually, I was surprised it wasn't that different. In 73, it was 28 weeks.
Mm-hmm.
Now it's about 24 weeks. So even though a half century has elapsed, the medical technology has only moved up the period of viability about 4 weeks. I would have thought, a layperson looking at all the advances in technology, I would have thought the change would have been much bigger than it actually is.
There's a huge difference, though, between 24 and 28 weeks gestation.
Mm-hmm. I understand it has something to do with the lungs, correct?
That's correct. That a fetus's lungs start to develop a lot faster after the 25-week period. So, I mean, it seems like a small number, but in the gestation of a fetus, it's actually a big leap from 24 to 28.
Okay. Having said that, I talked with my best friend who's a pediatrician, so he filled me in. They're now trying to, there are some cases where the fetus can survive at 20 weeks by, I think, using steroids to to develop the lungs.
A lot of steroids. I was reading an article that was saying that they now are saying that 50% of fetuses at the age of 23 weeks can survive outside of the womb with significant medical intervention.
Mm-hmm. Well, maybe let's now move from the technical side to the legal question. So I'm going to just briefly summarize my understanding of Roe, try to convey why I think it's wrongly argued, and then you can comment on it and tell me where you think I go right and where you think I go wrong. Does that sound right to you?
Yep.
I think we're going to fundamentally agree on all of it, but absolutely.
I'm not positive about that because my views are really a layperson's understanding, having just sat down and read the relevant material, but not not having the kind of legal experience you've had over 30 years with the court system. So the way I see it is as follows. The Roe decision declared, based on its reading of the 14th Amendment, the 14th Amendment protects a right to liberty. And that right to liberty has been interpreted by the courts as including a right to privacy. And the Roe decision written by Harry Blackmun says there's a right to privacy in our constitutional system, in our Constitution. It's not written into it, but there's a right to privacy. The court has developed a right to privacy. And Blackmun says that that right covers the right of a woman to have an abortion up until what he calls the compelling point of viability. The compelling point of viability, I won't go into all the technicalities, but it basically means when a fetus can survive, a life of a fetus can be sustained outside the womb with medical technology. At that point, a woman loses her right to an abortion, except if it threatens her physical And I think also, I can't remember now, and also I think her mental well-being, maybe just the physical, but also maybe mental well-being.
As far as I know, just the physical.
Just the physical.
Mhm.
Okay. So now, what's wrong with that decision? I'm going to list a couple of things that I think are wrong, and then I want to hear Jessica's opinion. And Jessica, please don't call me Mr. Finkelstein, because it's either professor, doctor, or Norm, and I prefer Norm. So
Right.
here's what I think is wrong with the decision. Under our there are three ways you can discover a fundamental right in our system of law. A fundamental right can be one, it's clearly enumerated in our Constitution. So the right to speech, the right to press, the right to assembly, etc., the right to bear arms, not to be subject to illegal seizure, invasions of your home. Those are all fundamental rights. They're clearly enumerated in the Constitution. A second way in which there might be a fundamental right is what the court calls a right that's not explicitly enumerated in our Constitution, but a right that's deeply rooted in our nation's history and tradition.
Mhm.
If the court discovers a right that's deeply rooted in our history and tradition, then it counts as, or it's regarded as, a fundamental right. So let's just look at those. Okay. And the third possibility is to discover within this fundamental right to privacy,
Mhm.
what Harry Blackman, uh, pointed to see abortion as one variation of that fundamental right to privacy. Now, let's turn to abortion. Number one, clearly not enumerated in our Constitution. You're not
Correct.
going to find anything in our Constitution that says a woman has a right to abortion. So that we can discard quickly. Number two, is it a right deeply rooted in our nation's history and tradition? Well, Samuel Alito, in his leaked opinion, he goes through that history with a fine-tooth comb,
He does.
and he shows clearly that abortion was, in one form or another, illegalized or criminalized before and after what's called the period of quickening, where you feel movement of the baby in your body, the fetus in your body.
That's correct.
That from the beginning in our common law and our statutory law, there was no there was no right to abortion that's deeply rooted in our history and tradition. Quite the contrary, it was illegal or criminal from the beginning of our nation's history. So that doesn't work. And then you have the third possibility. Is it a form of privacy that is protected by our Constitution? And what the way the court usually reasons is it looks for what it calls a line of cases.
Mhm.
It looks for a pattern of cases
And there are
and
none.
whether the right to abortion fits into this pattern. So Alito, fairly in my opinion, he looks at the cases bearing on issues of sex and privacy
Mhm.
that precede Roe. So there's Griswold, 1965,
Yep.
says a married couple has the right to use contraception in its marital bedroom.
Mhm.
Then he looks at Baird, Eisenstadt versus Baird, where the court rules an unmarried couple has the same right of privacy to use contraception. Then he looks at Loving versus Virginia, which says a couple that's in love have the right to marry because marriage is something sacred to our personal lives.
That's right.
And finally, he looks at Stanley, which says you have the right to view pornography in the privacy of your bedroom or your home. And then Alito says those are the 4 privacy cases which are closest to Roe. But he says if you look at the cases, they just don't raise the same core issue as Roe. Roe raises the question of that status of the fetus, that problematic question mark status of the fetus. That is a totally, and I have to say, totally different consideration than the other 4 cases.
It is.
That you're now trying to figure out
And
what is the status of that fetus, and does a woman's right to privacy trump the status of that fetus? And
right.
Alito says it's a separate issue. So the right of privacy, that constitutional right to privacy, does not cover the issue of abortion. The bottom line is it's not an enumerated right.
That's right.
It's not a right deeply rooted in our history and our tradition, and it's not a right covered by the constitutional protection for privacy, and therefore there is no constitutional right to abortion.
And I agree with you 100%. I mean, it's unfortunate. I don't love saying that I agree with Justice Alito on anything, but he's absolutely right. His examination of Roe is absolutely right. And that is the core issue. The question of whether or not a fetus can survive, when life begins, it's inextricable from the legal issue at hand. And the other cases that you mentioned, they don't have that problem. There's no existential question in any of those. And that's the real problem with Roe. And it's
I think, by the way, that was excellently phrased. And I'm going to use that in the future because that, I think, cuts to the core. There is no existential question in the other cases, and therefore Roe does not form a line with them.
Right.
That I think is correct.
And that's the thing is people don't understand about the Constitution, nor should they, because it's not something that everybody wants to pick up and read. But what people don't understand about the Constitution it's not this, voluminous document that lays out, well, if the question is this, then this is the answer. If the question is that, then this is the answer. It really is kind of a study guide for good citizenship. And that's why we have justices, is to interpret the bare bones of the Constitution. And it was never meant to answer a question like, when does life begin?
And I would want to just add to that, it's not only that it wasn't intended to answer that question. The problem is the question can't be answered. It is not an answerable question. Now, what happens in both Roe and Alito's opinion is that they pretend not to try to answer the question. They think they can solve the enigma of abortion without answering the question. But of course, their answer on abortion presumes an answer on the question of when life begins. That sounds very cryptic, so let me be concrete. The Roe decision says a woman has a right to an abortion, but once you reach the compelling point of viability, a woman loses the right to an abortion. Now, the question obviously is, why does the woman lose the right at viability? Why is that the point? So, Roe says, we don't know where life begins. Roe says, philosophers don't know, theologians don't know, physicians don't know, so of course we don't know, and we don't pretend to know. Okay, that's what Roe says.
Mm-hmm.
But then Roe says a state has a compelling interest to protect, now listen to the expression, to protect prenatal life.
Right.
I want all of your listeners to hear prenatal life. And the court determines that the state can intervene to protect prenatal life at the point of viability. Well, then what is the court saying? If it's saying that it's intervening at the point of viability to protect prenatal life,
Mm-hmm.
it's saying that life begins at viability.
Right.
And if, let's say, life began before the point of viability, the state would have had a compelling interest to intervene before viability because it's life. The court establishes we will intervene at the point of viability. But if you're saying you're intervening at the point of viability, you're in effect saying that you believe life begins at viability. Otherwise, why choose that point? Justice Scalia, who was absolutely correct, and he said, why do you say life begins at viability? All that happens at viability is a fetus can survive outside the womb. But that's a medical, a technical, a technological determination. It says nothing about when life begins. It just means the fetus can survive outside the womb. But life might have begun much earlier than viability. Viability tells you nothing about when life begins. So I thought Scalia was correct that this viability standard on the basis that's prenatal life presumes that the life begins at viability, but there's no basis for that. Nobody knows when life begins.
Right, and it's not a question that anybody should answer. And I think that's one of the big problems is people confuse the terms viability and when life begins. And again, I'll go back to what I said. That is an existential question. The age of viability is kind of set. It changes a little bit, but as you said, it doesn't change that much. But where life begins, I mean, that's a question that everybody has to answer for themselves.
I think that's correct. That's why Alito, it's amusing because Alito did the same thing as Roe.
Yep.
Let me just explain what happened. According to the Texas statute that was litigated, that's currently being litigated in the Supreme Court, they allow for an abortion up until 15 weeks.
Mm-hmm.
That's the current statute in Texas. Allows a woman an abortion up to 15 weeks. And then they say, after 15 weeks, says the Texas statute, to destroying abortion, they call it barbaric. I mean, to destroy a fetus, they call it barbaric. Because you'll know much better than me. I don't know the technical stuff. The procedure that's used, dilation and evacuation, according to the Texas statute, it basically shreds the fetus. That's how they describe it. I don't know if it's true or not, but they describe it as basically putting the fetus in a meat grinder. That's the way it looks.
Not entirely an accurate medical description, but I mean, it's definitely got shock value and it has its purpose in the way it was written.
Right. When I read it, I'll be honest with you, I was shocked. And I read it to my class and they were kind of shocked also. So it had its shock value. But the point is, if you believe that life begins at conception,
right,
then it's also barbaric to destroy the fetus on day one.
Sure.
So
before you even know it's there.
Right. Yeah. So Alito says, I don't know where life begins. I don't pretend to know where life begins. I have no idea where life begins. But then he says, the 15th week is a rational place to deny abortion at the 15th week. It's only rational if you think life begins at the 15th week. It's not very rational if you think life begins on day one.
I mean, if you think life begins at day one, then any woman that has a glass of wine before she knows she's pregnant can be charged with child endangerment. So
yes. So Alito, his decision, his support for the Texas statute, I think is as flawed as Roe. Absolutely. Because it presumes that up until the 15th week, it's not barbaric to terminate the pregnancy, but after the 15th week, it becomes barbaric. Why? Well, obviously, because you think after the 15th week, the fetus is a life.
I mean, that's part of it, but I think also the description, especially in the Texas legislation of the actual procedure, serves a purpose. Because if you're talking about a procedure after 15 weeks, it's extremely different than a procedure at 8 weeks, right? And I think that's what people are getting confused with a lot. Is
the procedure may be different. I'm not going to quarrel because I don't know. The procedure may be different, but the consequence is the same.
That's right.
If you think life begins at conception, the procedure can be as gentle as a dove, but you're killing a child if you believe life begins at conception. That's why I said it's really beside the point whether the procedure of dilation and evacuation is brutal. Right. Because even if you use a quote unquote gentle procedure, if you believe life begins at conception, it's murder.
That's exactly right. And again,
so both of the decisions, both Alito and Blackmun in Roe, they're both, in my opinion, on the fundamental question, when does life begin? Number one, they both claim we don't know.
Right.
But on the other hand, the whole actual statute presumes that we do know.
Right.
For Roe, it's viability. For Alito, it's the 15th week.
And I don't think that's unintentional, because you can't create legislation based on something that you say you don't know the answer to.
I agree. I think that's totally right. That's what my student said. One of my students, he said, if you don't know when life begins, and you shouldn't be, you shouldn't be, you shouldn't have brought this case before the court.
That's right. It's an intentional confusion between those two terms, because they can't write a law based on an existential question like, when does life begin?
I totally agree. Jason, do you have something to say?
Sorry, I've been arguing with people in the chat.
Oh, I thought you were taking advantage of Stanley.
No, I actually was been going back and forth. I try to be somewhat active There seems to be a discussion that someone has that I disagree with, that they made a comment that said that, oh, we're just trying to criminalize pregnancy. And I was like, I don't think that's the case.
No.
Criminalize pregnancy? No, I take the position, in my view, you have two very real problems. Number one, you don't know where life begins. It's possible that it begins at conception. It's possible that at a future date, assuming the planet survives, which I think is doubtful, but assuming the planet survives, I think it's possible that we will look with the same abhorrence at abortion as the humanity will look with the same abhorrence of abortion as we do now when we read Plato's Republic, and he talks about disposing of children who have physical defects, and he has all these elaborate procedures for disposing of them. And then when you read Plato's Republic, you think, Jesus Christ, that's pretty fucking sick. And I think it's quite possible that judgment will be rendered on our protection of the right to abortion. On the other hand, number one, there are some really extreme circumstances where it's just hard to deny a woman the right to abortion in any good faith. Number two, we don't know what history's verdict will be. And number three, it's really tough to figure out the question where life begins. So with all those considerations, my own view, and it's as Jessica said, these are personal resolutions of the question. I think a woman should have the right to an abortion from conception to birth because we don't know too many things. On the other hand, because there is a reasonable possibility that future generations will consider abortion as barbaric as we look at child sacrifice or Plato's Republic, I think there should be a severe social stigma on abortion, not a legal criminalization of it, but a severe social stigma. Sort of like there is a commandment, thou shalt not kill. And that's a very powerful commandment in our society. On the other hand, we do make an allowance for self-defense. Now, even those who commit murder in self-defense a lot of times feel very guilty about it. They still feel very guilty about because of that severe social stigma, thou shalt not kill. But we recognize that right to self-defense has to be included with, or as a caveat, an exception to thou shalt not kill. And that's how I feel with the abortion. There should be a severe social stigma on it, but the woman at the end of the day has to decide whether I am going to violate that severe social stigma because I feel in this situation I have that quote unquote right to self-defense. In this case, right to commit an abortion. So that's how I, in my own mind, how I reasoned it. The problem I have is, number one, I believe in reason. I believe in truth. I don't think reason and truth should take sides. I've read Roe. I've read it once, twice, 3, 4, 5. I have it right here. I'm rereading it again tonight because I'm just trying to get absolute clarity on it. Roe has no basis in the Constitution, and it's internally completely incoherent because it says we don't know where life begins, but then it says the state has an interest in protecting prenatal life.
Right.
That's the point of viability. So you have already decided life begins at the point of viability, and that's why the state is intervening and denying a right to abortion. So it doesn't make any sense, the ruling. And I get very angry when I hear people, you know, trying to say Alito's this, Alito's that, Alito's this, Alito's that. Yeah, he's all those things. I'm not going to deny it. I don't even know the guy. I don't know much about him, but I'm perfectly willing to believe he's a sack of shit. Fine, I'm willing to believe it. But that doesn't change the law.
That's right. People like to.
You can say I don't give a damn what the law says. Fine, that's a position. You can say I don't give a damn, but you can't say, oh, the Constitution protects. I have my right to privacy. It's right there. No, it does not.
And people like to wield the law like it's the sharpest tool in their arsenal, and it's really not, because there are a lot of things in life, a lot of decisions to be made that aren't rooted in the law and never should be. And that's a problem that a lot of people have with the Roe decision is, and a lot of people say, oh, well, this is a law. This is legally incorrect, or this is legally correct. And a lot of times they're not right. And there are a lot of things that shouldn't be decided by law. Oh, go ahead.
Well, I mean, didn't you say the other day when we were talking about this, when the decision first came down and you were sitting there with a stack that you had printed out, reading the Alito, what is it called? Brief.
Draft
Decision.
Yeah.
Yeah. Did you say there's only 12 states where abortion would become illegal?
When I was actually reading an article that was saying that there are 12 states that have actual laws on the books right now that make abortion illegal.
Now, here's my question to both of you very smart people. Why? And again, there has been cases for the last few years of women getting criminally charged.
So that's actually a misconception.
Why is no one talking about it? Why does it always take? And this is we had a show on Saturday kind of talking about how around the globe the left is getting kind of obsessed with law, and there's a certain type of person that's saying they're a leftist, definitely more upper middle class, that's kind of in love with all this lawfare, but they're losing a lot of these cases. Well, so when we talk about where I disagreed with the verbiage of the criminalization of pregnancy, I think you really have to get into like poverty. If you really want to have that conversation, then you can't have it without talking about poverty and laws that center around social services. So if you get certain services, you are constantly being monitored. That's a whole different discussion. We actually had a little bit of that discussion on Thursday, if you want to get into that. And that's a little different of a discussion than kind of an across the board fiery statement that I think is just a little empty. But why is it that it takes the Alito brief to be leaked? And we did talk off air about the idea that it being leaked kind of speaks more to the undemocratic nature of the Supreme Court in general. But why does it take it for this to have a discussion about something that for a lot of people seems pretty undemocratic? I mean, how do these laws in these states get passed?
Well, I'd actually like to address the first part of that. It's a misinterpretation of and it's a bit of hysteria that abortion is criminalized in states. I see articles all the time. They're like, oh, this woman was arrested for getting an abortion. She's charged criminally. Civil penalties. There are lots of laws on the books in these more conservative states that have civil penalties, not for the women who get abortions, but for doctors who perform them. I'm not saying that's a good thing. I definitely don't support it. But there's actually in these laws that allow civil penalties for doctors to perform abortions, there are actually clauses that indemnify the woman from any kind of penalties whatsoever. So people that are going on and on about how, abortion, you're going to get arrested, it's a class blah, blah, blah felony, that's not correct. The other thing I saw on Twitter, which is where you should never go for your legal advice, I saw on Twitter the other day, there was a lawyer who posted, I love this, Tennessee just made it a Class E felony to order mifepristone through the mail. That is the drug that's given to women to have an abortion. It's called a chemical abortion before, I believe it's 12 weeks in most states. That's also not correct. It is illegal for a private citizen to order mifepristone through the mail. It is 100% legal for a pharmacy or a clinic or a doctor to do so and to prescribe it in the states where it is still accessible. So it's this kind of misinterpretation and kind of hysteria that promotes those rumors, for lack of a better term, and it really gets people riled up. It's not accurate.
Well, my thing, and I said this before, Norm, you weren't on the show, and I said this. I don't like to get too much in the political weeds of electoralism, but the Democratic Party in this Joe Biden administration hasn't really done anything. But the one thing that has, in my opinion, kind of kept them somewhat viable is the fact that the far right wing of the GOP that is in a lot of these state legislatures is just so batshit with these over-the-top laws that it definitely feeds into a certain hysteria, and it definitely gets the donor dollars running. You know, my email hasn't stopped with, they're going to overturn Roe. We're going to need $5. Can you believe this? We're going to need some money for the primaries are coming up. We can't let the fascists win.
Well, I'll tell you, that brings me to a point which we discussed off air, but it's very relevant to what you just said. For many years, it was always the Roe scare. Mm-hmm. That they're going to overturn Roe. They're going to overturn Roe. I said, that's just nonsense. It's just fundraising, as you put it, the scare tactic. And then the last couple of years, I began to rethink my own view about whether it was just a scare tactic, because one thing you notice about Supreme Court decisions is Supreme Court decisions are highly, highly, highly sensitive to public opinion for a very obvious reason. Because once you come down with a decision, it has to be enforced. And if public opinion is overwhelmingly against the decision, you're going to have a hell of a time trying to enforce that decision. Mm-hmm. So the courts have to always have their antenna up for what public opinion is, what public opinion is willing to tolerate, what public opinion isn't willing to tolerate. So to take an example, 1986, the court rules same-sex sodomy illegal under are not protected by our Constitution, not protected by our Constitution. It knows the public's not there yet. 2003, they legalized same-sex sodomy. It's called the Lawrence decision, but they're very careful. They're very careful in that decision. They say it's only a right of privacy, that you can screw who you want in your bedroom. But it says this has nothing to do with formal recognition of the right. And it's very clear. They're very worried that somebody might interpret this decision as leading the way to gay marriage. And they know the public in 2003 isn't ready for gay marriage. So they grant the constitutional protection, but they say it's strictly a question of privacy. As you recall, when Obama ran for president in 2008, he said, I'm against same-sex marriage. I'm against it. Civil unions, fine, but marriage is only for a man and a woman, because he knew public opinion wasn't going to support same-sex marriage. And then comes 2015, Obergefell, the same-sex marriage, public opinion is there now.
Right.
And so the court does exactly what it said it wasn't going to do in 2003. In 2003, it said, this has nothing to do with gay marriage. It's only, they'll be fucking in private, but it's not going to bother us, But now, 2015, they say gay marriage. So all along, the best barometer of public opinion is not Gallup, it's the Supreme Court.
That's right.
They tell you where public opinion more or less is. So what happened with the Alito opinion? What happened with the Alito opinion is the court is always trying to gauge the limits, the parameters of the broad public.
Mhm.
But by the time we come to the Roe now, there is no broad public anymore. The country has become very polarized, as in the Senate, right down the middle, except for Cinema Manchin on one side, and sometimes Colin and Murkowski on the other side. There is no middle. It's gone. The center has not held. And so each side no longer feels the need to accommodate a broad public. And so each side is just going to go with its side. No accommodation, no compromise, no nothing. And that's why I had to rethink my view that maybe they will reverse Roe, because they don't care about the roughly 50% of Americans who support the right to abortion. They don't care anymore. And that's the nature of the court has changed because our political landscape and discourse have changed. You go watch the programs now. If you watch Fox News, I don't watch television, but I was curious in this particular case because I've been studying it closely. They just call about the Dems, the Dems, the Dems, the Dems. And then you turn on the liberal press and it's the conservatives, the conservatives. Each side just lumps the other in one homogeneous whole. There's no center. And each side demonizes the other side as being freaks and totally out of touch with the proverbial American people. And so now you have a decision like Alito's opinion. The only one who seems, and it's unclear how much, the only one who seems to want to try to accommodate a broader center is obviously Chief Justice Roberts. But whether he succeeds or not, only God knows.
Well, we are at an hour, and if you guys want to continue this conversation with us in the champagne room where the phone lines will be open. Oh, I said it. Phone lines will be open. So if you have something to say to me, you can say it to my face, ish. So I'm excited for the phone calls on this one. They will be brief. And someone said, "Oh Lord," exactly. Oh Lord. But
Lord.
But here's the thing. I only open up the phone lines behind a paywall. No one hates you enough to pay to tell you to F off. We're leftists here. This was a right-wing show. You guys would pay all the time to tell me to F off. These are broke people. Someone's telling me to F off. I pay for it.
Outrage has a price tag.
Yeah. You attach a price tag to the middle fingers.
I'll pay for everybody who can show proof that they earn under $500 a year. and I want to see the income tax statement. Hey, I'm Jewish. Remember how Jessica said off air she hates those qualifiers like you look great for your age?
Mm-hmm.
Oh, I'm Jewish and I have my qualifier. I'll pay for you if you earn under $500 a year. I
So
know,
part
I
of
know,
Jessica is
I
mad.
know your viewers will hate that qualifier.
I can definitely relate.
Part of you can relate.
Part of me can relate.
Part of you can relate. Well, yes, definitely. Someone says means testing the call-in show. Yes, yes, always means testing the call-in show. And on that note, guys, thank you so much for joining us. We will be back. What is today? Thursday. We'll be back Saturday morning. We're doing a great show on Ethiopia. I have a professor coming in with a very long name. I don't want to say it wrong, so I'm not going to say it. But I was on David Feldman's show with him, and we had a great talk about Ethiopia. And I was like, let's continue this on our show. And I have a special co-host on that show as well. Just special co-hosts all the time. Love it. Mixing it up. So thank you guys, and we are out.